Hey everybody, Phil here. I got a couple of questions about adjusting to specific opponent types. And I want to talk to you about a general adjustment concept that I think is super, super important. And from there, I want to talk about building reads. The most common question I've gotten throughout these adjustment videos is, Phil, how do you go about building reads? So at the end of this video, I'll walk you through that as well. So I recently did a video on how to adjust to somebody who is underbluffing, specifically underbluffing rivers. And I talked about the many ways in which you take advantage of that, not just on the river. I recommend you check it out if you're interested in that kind of thing. I got a few questions and a couple, specifically asking, can you exploit an underbluffer through aggression, or is that futile? And another question asking, how do you adjust to somebody who's not value betting thinly enough? And actually, these two specific questions, they were longer questions. They kind of go a long way out of where I'm going to talk about today. But they brought up an important concept. They made me think of an important concept that I really want to talk about. So when somebody is making a mistake, whether it be not value betting thinly enough, not bluffing enough, that does something to the range that they're betting, the range that they're being aggressive with, but it also does something to the range that they're not betting. It has to. A lot of people think, oh, well, this player, is super passive and they're just not bluffing enough. But I, can't bluff them very well because they call a lot, or because they're so passive, maybe they're trapping a little bit more. But here's the thing. If, let's say, you raise button and the big blind calls, flop is whatever. They check, you check. Turn is whatever. They check. So let's say that in this spot, this is called a turn probe opportunity. A probe bet is when your opponent had the impetus on the previous street, they check back. Now you're first to act. You have the opportunity to bet. So this is a probe opportunity, turn probe opportunity. Let's say that they miss basically all their bluffs in this spot that a solver would bet. So what do you know? You know that their probing range is way too strong. So when they do probe, you're going to fold a lot. But you have to keep in mind that all of these hands that were supposed to bluff in this turn probing range, those hands had to go somewhere. They're now in the turn checking range. And so now when they check, even if they check all of the hands they're supposed to check, they've also checked these extra ones that they're not supposed to check, that they're supposed to bluff with. And because they're bluffs, they're weak. And so now instead of having, let's say, a balanced 60% of their hands range, they have 75% of hands, and that extra 15 is weak. So their range as a whole has been weakened. And so now, even if they defend perfectly according to which hands are supposed to check call and check raise, like in a solver, they have those pesky 15% of extra weak hands that they just are going to have to fold because they're too weak for the most part. Now, obviously, some of those are potential semi-bluffs on the turn, and they can check call or they can check raise, whatever. But essentially, anytime somebody doesn't put hands in a certain range, they end up in the other range, and that range becomes potentially attackable, more attackable, or less attackable. Same thing happens on the river. And so on the river, it's a little bit more clear. Let's say they check call flop, turn goes check, check, and now they check the river. So here, let's say they're not bluffing enough. Now when they bet, you should fold because their range is too strong. But also when they check, in addition to those, let's use the same numbers. So 60% of hands that were supposed to check, and they're supposed to call a pot size bet with 30% of them, which is half. Now they've checked 75, and they only have 30% calling hands, but they have 45% folding hands. So they're actually going to overfold this spot because they've just put weak hands in that range that are not supposed to be there. And the same thing happens with people who don't value bet enough. So let's go back to the turn probe opportunity. Let's say somebody's just let's just use the opposite example to illustrate a point, which is, somebody on the turn in a probe opportunity is betting all of their potential semi-bluffs. So they have an open ender, they have a gut shot, they have a flush draw, they love to bet. They have a future flush draw blocker and an overcard, they love to bet. So they find all the bluffs and maybe even too many bluffs. But when they have whatever it may be, mid pair, good kicker, or weak top pair that's supposed to go for two streets of value, they don't like to. It makes them uncomfortable. So they check those hands. Well, now they have a checking range that's too strong because, so their betting range is too weak, and you know what to do against that. You call a lot and raise a lot. And then once you call down, assuming they bluff river appropriately with their now weakened range. But they also now have added some potential value bets, or would be value bets, should be value bets, to their checking range. So their checking range now, instead of being 60% that's well balanced, it's 60% with that extra 15% pretty good hands. And so now you don't want to attack that range. You want to underbluff against that range. You don't want to, well, you might not want to go quite as thinly for value, but most of the value hands can still value bet. But they're going to call more often because they have those hands left over in their checking range. So the point I wanted to illustrate is, whatever the adjustment we're talking about, whatever the leak is, because I can make YouTube videos for the next 10 years, and we won't cover every specific spot that could ever come up in the game of poker. I want you to be able to think through, all right, well, I know this about my opponent, and I know what to do against that. I know how to adjust to that. But what does that mean about their other ranges? And how do I adjust to that? It's a super important part of adjusting to specific opponents. And I play a lot of heads-up poker, so it's always front of mind for me. What is wrong about their range in the most obvious spot? And then those hands that are missing from that range, or those hands that are added from that range, they're either added or removed from a different range, and you get to attack that too. And you don't necessarily attack it on that specific street. It could be on a later street, like you've seen me talk about in previous adjustment videos. The adjustments are not always super obvious and straightforward, but basically every range mistake that you make has a domino effect, and it impacts all the other ranges you have, and that compounds street by street. And so even the best players in the world, by the time they get to the river, their range is out of whack. And if you can figure out in which specific way it's out of whack, that's how you figure out how to beat them. So I hope that was helpful. Thank you all for the questions. I know I actually didn't answer any specific questions that the commenters meant to ask, but made me think of a great concept. So one question that I've been getting a lot that I can actually answer is, how do you go about developing reads? This is a very common question, and I didn't want to make a full video on it because it's actually, there's not a lot to it, or there is a lot to it, but there's not a lot to explain in video format. So essentially, the main thing I want to emphasize is that you should really focus on hands that are shown down. I'm talking about live poker here, by the way, but when you're playing, and it's very common that you will feel like somebody's playing really aggressively, or you will feel like somebody's folding a lot. You really, I hate to say it because like you're trying to process information all the time, but you really can't trust yourself and those feelings about things that are statistical. Now, if you're actually tracking how often they're betting the turn, and you're tracking how often they're folding the river, that's a different story. You can have some real data, but it also doesn't tell you the whole story. So I've sometimes played against people who seem really aggressive, and I'm like, okay, well, this person's feels like they're pushing me out of every pot, and so I'm gonna make a stand. I'm gonna call them down, and then what it turns out is the case is they're just like never slow playing, and they're going way too thinly for value. And so they're still like, they're really aggressive with a pretty strong range because they're just missing some bluffs and they're adding too many value. And now, this person that I feel like's been running me over, they've been running me over with top pair and making me fold second pair. And now I call them down with third pair and I lose. So that's one of the reasons you can't really trust non-showdown aggression or passive play or folding. And the other reason is just that you're first of all, like, we're terrible at estimating things like that. Our memories are, there's emotion involved. And so you're going to remember more of the times when you're pushed out of a pot. You're going to remember more of the times that your hero called on the river because those are more painful moments or frustrating moments. A lot of times when, whatever, you bet flop with top pair and you bet again on the turn and they fold, just like that's over. You don't think about it. And also just the sample sizes, especially if you're playing live poker, they're just too small. Like if if over the course of 1 week, you're playing at a 9-handed table with the same 8 people, how many times are you going to see one player have the opportunity to fold to a river bet? It's not very often. And, let's say that they fold on average 50% of the time, and you've seen, I'm totally guessing, but let's say you've seen 25 opportunities for them to fold. It's really easy for them to have folded 18 of 25 just because they've been unlucky in their hand distribution over those 25 hands. Just not a lot of data. So really focus on showdowns, because it only takes one showdown where you see somebody like value bet a hand that has no business value betting, or you see them bluff with like a pretty crazy hand, or you see them not bluff with the bottom of their range. That tells you so much about the way that they play. So much faster than seeing, 100 hands play out where you don't get to see their cards. So the only point I wanted to make is pay attention to showdowns, and pay attention to showdowns.
So Phil, speaking for yourself, when you're gathering data, looking to make adjustments, is that a gut reaction? You're just slowly getting a feeling, I think he's doing this? Or is it much more conscious and front of mind where you're saying, okay, he's done something like that 8 times. I think that means that it's 60% likely that he's making this type of mistake. So the adjustment I make would be this.
Yeah. So let me give an answer that's potentially usable. So in finding these reads on your opponent, I'd love to talk about how to go about developing them and how I go about finding them. The issue is there are 2 very separate answers to that. And one of them is, if you're playing online on a site that has hand histories, you have access to a lot of data. And if you're playing against the same opponent for long enough, you have a lot of data on that opponent. And so data and statistics become a huge part of figuring that out. And so it's not only, let me skip back. If you don't have that, either because you're playing live, or because you're playing on a site that doesn't provide hand histories, or because you're just playing against somebody, you play 200 hands against them, it's not enough to have any reliable statistics, then it's all about showdowns. It's all about looking at showdowns. And in that case, what I do is I do watch a hand play out, and basically if I see at showdown a spot where like they check with a very good bluffing hand, or they bluff with like a really bad bluffing hand, no relevant blockers, and then I start to think, okay, well maybe they underbluff or maybe they overbluff, and I keep an eye out for it. Supporting evidence that they overbluff is not always obvious. So let's say you think somebody overbluffs. Part of the supporting evidence you can get for that is that when they check, they don't show like potential bluffing hands. They always show, oh, I have second pair. Oh, I have third pair. Oh, I have top pair. And so that can support the evidence that, well, you've seen them bet a couple hands that you don't think should bet. You haven't seen them check a hand that you think should bluff. And those things add up over time. And then you can also, like, less reliable data is, when they check, it doesn't seem like they're check folding a lot, because maybe all of the hands that would have to check fold have bluffed, for example. That's that way. And then if you have access to statistics, it's much different, because in addition to the showdowns, you can see, oh, well, their fold percentage is too high in this spot. From there, you do have to kind of investigate, okay, why is it too high? Because there could be a lot of explanations. First of all, it could be, they fold hands that they shouldn't. But second of all, it could be they get there with too many weak hands, either because they didn't bluff them earlier, or because they've value bet too many hands earlier that should either slow play or just pot control, whatever the case may be. And so you go on a mission kind of to find, okay, well, I see that this stat is off by a lot, and it's enough of a sample that I think it's legit. So level 1 is you could just be like, all right, I'm just going to bluff here a lot, and that will work. But to find the best counter adjustment, you have to kind of find the root cause. And it's okay, so they're folding a lot here. Why? Is it like I said, because they just fold hands that should not fold, or they've gotten there with a messed up range? And usually when you investigate, you'll find that they did get there with a messed up range, and actually elsewhere they have messed up ranges too, and you actually find new things to take advantage of. And so that's why I like to investigate further. I'll see you next time. Take care, everybody.